In the long off time ago of 1993, a scribe known as Scott McCloud wrote a small book called Understanding Comics. This ancient text would forever influence comic book history. Okay. I thought I would do this intro, but it's not really good. You know that feeling, right? When art is just not really working out. It's, you can kind of tell when it's good or bad. Sometimes it's hard to pin down, so you seek out criticism. And other times you feel that way because a critic informed you about its quality. But art's subjective, right? Well, let's see what Scott McCloud thinks, because that's essentially what the 2016 graphic novel, The Sculptor, is talking about. And on top of that, it has a lot more to say as well. Imagine for a moment you're a failure. Things in seemingly every way have just not gone your way. That's kinda where story protagonist David Smith is at in the onset of this book. He is, big surprise, a sculptor, and once a fairly popular sculptor at that. Unfortunately, his name, David Smith, is a little similar to another sculptor, also named David Smith. David's at a cafe when he runs into death, like his uncle, who is the Grim Reaper. Death presents David an offer, essentially asking him if he's willing to give his life for his artwork. David seems pretty into the idea, leading Death to even simulating the total inconceivable nothingness that is death as a means of warning. Even then though, David accepts the offer, and it's from here he has only a certain amount of days remaining to live, but he can control and manipulate any material with his hands. He becomes the ultimate, supposedly limitless sculptor. Before all of this though, David has an incredibly painful past, essentially losing his entire family in cruel, devastating ways. It's easy to see why David would be so lost and depressed. Things just haven't been good for him. And truth be told, things really aren't gonna get better. He's pretty well kicked out of his apartment, is made a fool of at a party due to an overly elaborate prank, more on that later, and is all the while losing his faith and sense of trust in his friends. But then, his powers start kicking in, and he realizes that he can finally achieve everything he wants, or so he thinks. In this period of time between him getting his abilities and his inevitable death, David falls in love, gets rejected, then accepted, goes through huge epiphanies, and finally seems to think he knows what he wants out of his life. Until again, the rug is pulled out from underneath him. So, spoilers from here on out. If you haven't already read the comic, it's an absolutely brilliant read. You really should. So not only does David die, technically shown in the final sequence that's at the beginning of the book, but so does Meg, who at this point is pregnant, and oh my god, it's just so cruel. Meg being the lady who he fell in love with, by the way. The final tragic moments of this book are so painful and devastating, I can't help but get emotional thinking about it. But why is it so emotional? And how does it connect to artwork? Throughout the book, McCloud does not shy away from playing with panel layout and visual expectations in order for us to feel things along with David. In structuring the comic this way, Old Scotty has done two things. The first thing that happens is essentially us being able to immediately empathize with the sensations and feelings that affect David. When David is frustrated or overwhelmed, the panel structure becomes rigid and confining, and things like blockades of text bubbles litter each panel. When we want to see what's important to David, we get focused, huge panels. Sometimes we'll see his train of thought, with the textures and memories that matter the most clearly having the most vastness and detail. But here's the second thing. It makes for amazing contrast between all that is directly connected to our hero and all that is indirectly connected. Panels of crowds looking in awe, the cityscape, the completely external world of those who watch. It's those shots of people noticing too that stand out. They're these cathartic moments of awe and wonder. Because that's all David wants, to be seen, for his work to be acknowledged, and I suppose in a certain sense, what artist doesn't want that? I mean, that's what David wants initially, right? But then he falls in love with Meg, and by extension, we as readers understand why. Scott McCloud expertly sets us up to be invested in Meg, specifically in her being such a well-written character whose mood swings act as narrative arcs for David to hurdle. So Meg gets pregnant and then cruelly, suddenly, dies in one of the most sudden tone shifts of the whole book. And then Dave goes a little nutty and dies with his last creation being a building-sized sculpture of Meg and their unborn baby. And naturally, everyone is watching. David certainly got the audience and recognition he wanted, but at what cost? What's the point of artwork if you don't get to see people appreciate or at least acknowledge the work? I mean, David certainly wants people to validate his art, and by extension him. However, there's something remarkably special in what a competing artist does with one of her sculptures. She claims in a conversation with David and his arts manager best friend that there are numerous details left in her sculptures that she knows no one will ever see, nor does she want them to see. She's making quality artwork not because she necessarily wants an audience, but because she wants to create work that properly expresses herself, regardless of who sees it. Through this conversation, the artist, Mira, brings up the viewers, and how, in a sense, the market is the medium. This is McCloud almost directly standing adjacent to arts and media scholar Marshall McLuhan, who, along with other colleagues, claimed that the medium is the message. These kinds of conversations are presented throughout the book, and I think there's a pretty solid reason why. Not only does it constantly help us understand David and the choices he makes with his powers, but it also constantly throws us into a state of uncertainty as readers trying to pin down a message or theme. If this was just a story that regurgitated the theories of Walter Benjamin or Bertolt Brecht, we would certainly, as thinkers, be able to walk away from this book reaffirming a certain school of thought in terms of why we make and praise artwork. And not that there's anything wrong with stories like that either. However, what McCloud is doing here is instead positing a newer, more perplexing conversation. What's worth more? A worthwhile insular life, or a short, painful existence that leaves a lasting legacy? The Sculptor posits plenty of moral and ethical challenges in and throughout its story. Questions arise about how to properly act in cases of depression, grief, and passing personal boundaries, yet the answers to these narrative conflicts remain isolated to David's experience, suggesting, in a certain way, that sensitive issues almost always require sensitive case-specific solutions. However, at the same time, there are those lingering ontological questions that persist, primarily focused on the overall value of life being at odds with the supposed necessity of quality artistic productions. Certainly, it's a given that art lasts quote-unquote forever, or at least it outlives the artist, much like new life. Meg and her unborn child are the last piece David creates before his death, immortalizing them so that they can last. We know that David has done this before, immortalizing his late sister in sculpture form early on in the plot. As well, this is a cathartic release as we've watched David struggle to properly sculpt Meg as he experiments with different facial expressions, unsure what best captures her. And even though the ending should be, in a certain way, a satisfying, all loose ends tied kind of conclusion, it's really not. It's bittersweet and crazy unfair given how things are actually being set up for David to pass on peacefully with Meg by his side. But it's all for naught. It appears that, through the process of dying, David gets a lot of what he wants: fame, viewership, love, a sense of control. But ultimately, we see it isn't worth it. The initial sacrifice he makes is the wrong one. Sure, people only care about an artist once they've died because we can look at their artistic contributions with more ease and certainty, but I think the Sculptor is giving us another reason. We look at art and fawn over depressed, suffering artists who kill themselves because deep down, we not only relate to them, but we also want to learn from them. Humans love learning about the pain and suffering of tortured souls, because those expressions are often the most authentic. We can observe the problems they went through and how they dealt with it, and it's almost natural to wonder why someone would need to express something, even at the cost of their life. David constantly wants his life to mean something, a lot like the art he makes, and he only sees this meaning as a product deriving itself from acknowledgement and validation. So perhaps it makes sense for him to die falling from his final sculpture. He used his last few moments of life to give his death a sense of meaning and purpose. For David, only in death was he able to achieve what he wanted from his life. Okay, so that's pretty harsh. Obviously, I'd like to say, hey, it's not all doom and gloom, but that wouldn't really be honest. The fact is, the Sculptor doesn't pull any punches when it shows how random, chaotic, cruel, and unfair death is. But in that same sense of chaos, it does show how precious and sacred life really is. All it can take for some in the most dire, precarious decisions to move forward is the right person, group, or community. And these parts of life can come from anywhere, anytime. So, even if Meg is just some actor in her eyes, to David, she was the angel that gave his life a new meaning. One outside of art or recognition. One in simple, humanistic interaction. The images don't necessarily deny meaning, but they're primarily powerful upon the very first milliseconds of looking at them. They convey sensations just as much as semiotic messages. And perhaps that's McCloud's plea or thesis for the Sculptor. Philosophy and discourse might be very important when it comes to art as well as the human condition in general, but those undescribable moments of connection and feeling, they're what to live for. And they're always fleeting, lost in under seconds sometimes. And in the context of the universe, none of that means anything. But in the context of a life, it can mean everything.